Thank you.
All you needed then was bagpipes. Welcome to the Core Concepts Lectures. This is a series of lectures where we have religious and spiritual leaders come to us and tell us what they believe, why they believe it, and what they're doing about it. And those of you who are seeing this for the first time, if somebody else is showing it to you and you want to go up, you can go to youtube.com and look for Renford, R-E-N-F-O-R-D, Broadcast Network. And you can see this series as they come out and go up. Our speaker today is Dr. Ronald McDonald. And no, he gets, I'm sure, tired of people talking about his name, Ronald McDonald. He says he is older than the Ronald McDonald and the restaurants. So we're pleased to have him. He's very much involved in spiritual counseling. Is that what you pastoral counseling, both at the state level and in the full United States. And he is a Quaker. He's going to be telling us something about his spiritual beliefs. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jim. Excuse me. Yes, my real name is Ronald McDonald. My friends call me Ron, and literally my friends, which Quakers are call me Ron quite a bit too. And we tend to go on a first name basis among Quakers because of the testimony of equality that we stand for. I have found over the years that people tend to ask me two questions most often when they hear I'm a Quaker. The first one is, what do Quakers believe? And very few of us, I don't know that anybody in our own Quaker meeting here in Memphis can answer that question, because Quakers don't have a set of orthodox beliefs. Orthodoxy means right beliefs. So we tend to be rather unorthodox, so that people can come to our Quaker meeting and with all sorts of perspectives on what their beliefs are. Secondly, people will often ask me, what do you think of the peace testimony? And that we can talk about a little bit, but as I reflected on what I wanted to say today to introduce my own beliefs, I thought that a good question for that would be this one: how can we be peaceful when there are so many good reasons to fight? And so I want to tell you a series of stories that describe the development of my own belief system, which is a Quaker's belief system, but not necessarily the Quaker's belief system, which there is none. It's not that we don't believe things, but there's not one that we as a corporate body all are surrounded by. When I was 12 years old in DeWitt, Arkansas in 1963, I thought the world revolved around baseball in the summer, football in the fall, and basketball in the winter time, punctuated a little bit by that stupid activity called farming. So my life was pretty pleasant. I loved living in DeWitt, a small little town in the delta of Arkansas near Stuttgart, and where rice was king and snakes were everywhere and mosquitoes were everywhere. But we loved that town because it was a great place for a young kid to grow up. And in 1963, the waves of the civil rights movement rolled through DeWitt in the form of a rumor. The rumor was that colored people were going to march on the swimming pool or the white churches, two sacred places in town. Probably more people were worried about the swimming pools than they were the churches. My dad happened to have been the minister at the First Methodist Church there in DeWitt, and on the Monday night after the Sunday morning worship service, the official board of the church that governed the church, aside from the governance that the pastor did, met, and one of our friends stood up and said, since the colored people might march on our church, I move that we instruct the ushers to turn them away at the door and point their way to the colored churches in town. And it was seconded, and a discussion ensued. Very quickly in that discussion, it was clear that my dad would veto that. And in the Methodist Church, since it's an Episcopal system of governance, the minister vetoes it. Only the bishop can override that veto. And so they decided to table the motion for a month before the until the next official board meeting. And during that time, they would politic with my dad to convince him that segregation was the right thing for the church and he ought to go along with it. And so for this 12-year-old boy, a few days after that happened, I began to sense that something other than basketball, football, and baseball was going on in this town. And my dad was I caught him in these serious conversations on the phone and with people at church and all that I could not quite understand, but I knew something was happening. And what people were learning about my dad very quickly was that he would veto this and he was not going to change his mind. And my dad very quickly called the bishop and said, "Will you support me on this?" And he said yes. So it was pretty clear that the church, which was very much inclined to vote yes to this proposal, was going to vote yes for something that the minister was going to veto, and the church could very easily split apart. And so the rumors and the discussions got more and more heated, but all I heard was news that something was happening. Until one night at supper, my older brother David asked my dad what was going on, and he said, "Boys, I do want to tell you what's happening." He said, "Some of the people in our church think that colored people should not be seated if they come to our church. And that's what this discussion is about." And David immediately asked my dad, "Well, what do you think, Daddy?" And my dad said, "Well, if Jesus were one of our ushers, what do you think Jesus would do?" And I remember we sat quietly, and no one answered that question because we all knew the answer. We knew what my dad's answer was for sure, and his answer had immediately become my answer in my own heart. And when the official board, the Sunday before the official board meeting, everybody knew that Charles McDonald, my dad, was going to address this issue. And as much as people were against what he was going to say, the church was packed. People love controversy, so the church was packed. And I remember when he preached the sermon that was over my head, I wasn't old enough to understand exactly what he was talking about. I remember the place getting quieter than I had ever heard the church before. Sometimes when people are inspired, they get loud, and sometimes when they're inspired, they get quiet and subdued. And the place got so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop on the road as my dad continued to talk. And as he talked, he shook because of the feelings that he had about it. And I sat there in the congregation in the second row where I always sat, praying to God, "Please, God, help my daddy not to cry in public and embarrass me." That's a 12-year-old's prayer. But he finished the sermon, and he looked out at this amazingly quiet, huge congregation, packed to the gills in the church. And it was time for him to say, "Let's turn to the hymnal and sing our last hymn," and the benediction would happen. And he suddenly said, "You're dismissed." And then he walked out back to his study, and the congregation sat there in stunned silence. And then people gradually began to get up and very quietly filed out of the church in hushed talk with each other. And the next night at the official board meeting, my dad, who had found some support from a few of his friends, one of them was the chairman of the official board. The chairman of the official board called the meeting to order, and immediately another of my dad's friends stood up and said, "Mr. Chairman, I move that the meeting be adjourned." And there was a second and a vote immediately, and the meeting was adjourned, and the vote was not taken, and the church did not split apart. But for me, the next year that we lived in DeWitt, before my dad was transferred to another church by the bishop, it was a hard year. I was turning 13, I was right in the middle of puberty, I wanted to fit in, and we were being called a slur, in-lovers, quite a bit in our family at that point. And even though I felt terrible about the way people were treating me, there was some pride in me that I had been a part of something that was bigger than me, that mattered a lot. And when we moved away the next year, I heard that the next minister did not stand against that proposal and it passed. That's not true, but that's what I understood to have happened for 20 years. And a bitterness grew inside of me that lasted and lasted. And I became fascinated with reading books on the sociology of the blacks in the city, and reading books of James Cone, Black Liberation Theology. And I had 3 roommates in college who were black, and I began to broaden out my view of the way one could live the world. And I was doing it partly because that's the way I wanted to, and partly as a rebellion against the things that I was bitter about. And it stayed inside of me for about 10 or 15 years, until one day my dad came up to me and said, "Do you remember the person who owned the hardware store that used to babysit for you once in a while?" "Yeah, I remember him." He said, "Well, his name is Johnny Shellhorn." I said, "I remember the Shellhorns. He was the only person in town that let me call him by his first name, Johnny." He said, "That's right." Well, I met him in Little Rock the other day, and he came up to me and he shook my hand and he said, "Charles McDonald, do you remember me?" I said, "Of course I do, Johnny." And he said, "Well, I'm the mayor of DeWitt now, and I want to tell you something. For years, we've had a fairly segregated town, but since I've become the mayor, we're having discussions with whites and blacks in the town for racial reconciliation in a way that's never happened in this town before. And I want you to know that it's because of that controversy we had in our church years ago when you raised the question of whether or not segregation was right. In those days, of course, I was a segregationist like everybody else was, but you made me think about it. And now that I'm a mayor, we're doing something about it." Well, for me, all that bitterness fell off of me like a glass on the floor, shattered on the floor. And I immediately thought of that parable of Jesus about the farmers going into the field and spreading seeds, and some of the seeds land in a place where all they get is sun and no water, and some of the seeds land where they grow a little and the weeds choke them to death, but some of the seeds land in good soil and receive the water and the sun and grow and bear great fruit. And I thought to myself, all those years I, of little faith, had not known and believed that the seeds that my dad would sow in that church, some of them would bear great fruit. And so, my first answer to that question, how can we be peaceful when there are so many good reasons to fight, is reason number 1. Some seeds bear fruit. Believe it. When I went to Hendrix College. And when I was in Hendrix, I came across a very interesting word, the Shekinah. It's not a word that's found in the Bible, but it's a Hebrew word, and it means roughly, it means the indwelling glory of God. It's a beautiful word. I was fascinated with it, and I took it to my favorite professor there, and his name was Francis Christie. And I said, "Dr. Christie, you ever heard of the word Shekinah?" He said, "Yes, I have. In fact, I was once teaching a course in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1950s in a Methodist church. And there was a homeless man who used to come into that congregation just to listen to my lectures on the Old Testament. And he would always stay around later. He had a beard and terrible, he was dressed homeless. And he would stay around after the lecture, and he would come up to me and he said, "Dr. Christie, the Shekinah has departed. The Shekinah has departed." And that's all Dr. Christie told me. And for about 3 years, I kept looking around. Well, what did that mean? Can the Shekinah depart? What would happen if the indwelling glory of God were not here anymore? What would happen if the Shekinah wasn't there? And I went for quite some time looking for it, until one day, by this time I had gone to seminary, Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And while I was in seminary, it was in 1976, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra decided to do its first, and not now it's only, but at that time, its first and only concert in the park. Because it was 76, it was the 200th anniversary of our nation's Declaration of Independence. And so me and 100,000 other people gathered on the big greensward there and sat down with our blankets around us and waited, and the Far Philharmonic played their beautiful music, and the last piece that they played was the William Tell Overture, you know, the Lone Ranger. And as they got closer and closer to the little fanfare, you could hear us all thinking, oh, the Lone Ranger's going to come. And you heard the trumpets come on. And just as it got to that part, before the strings come on, there's a little break. And 100,000 people jumped to their feet and roared, and then the strings come on. And I knew it. That was the Shekinah. I just saw the Shekinah. I just heard the Shekinah. I just felt the Shekinah. It was that little moment of silence when it seemed like nothing was happening, everything was happening. That was the indwelling glory of God. I was stunned by it. So reason number 2, how can we be peaceful when there are so many good reasons to fight? Because the Shekinah surrounds us. There is an envelope of silence, of quiet, of beauty, of feeling around all of us. The Shekinah surrounds us. When I was 47 years old, I decided that I would do what I had done when I was 27 years old, which was to do some roofing work. I was a carpenter's helper, and if you're a carpenter's helper in your 20s, that means you basically do the work that anybody could do that's hard to work, which is roofing. And so I decided I would roof my own house. So I climbed up on it and stripped it down, and I was working on it until I got to the really, really steep pitches. When I was 27, I didn't mind working on steep pitches, because I would imagine myself once in a while fall off that hot roof. I'd bounce around a little bit, rub my arm, and climb back up and go back to work. But at 47, I started imagining myself falling off the roof and breaking a bone and being crippled for life. And so I was scared.
And it's 67.
So I did all the work that I could do, just holding off on that really steep pitch. And then I got to the place where I had to do the steep pitch, and I was thinking, how am I going to do this? When my next door neighbor named Wally walked around the fence and came over as I was sitting on top of the roof, he said, Ron, I'm between jobs right now. He was 27, by the way. I'm between jobs right now, and I've done a lot of roofing. I'd love to work for you if you need any help. Well, I may be dumb, but I know Jesus when I see him. He just saved me. So I hired him to do the hard part, and I did the easy parts. One night, we finally stripped all that really steep stuff off the roof, and he said, "Do you think we ought to put tarps over this tonight?" I said, "No. It's only 20% chance of rain. It hadn't rained in 2 weeks. And they've been saying 20% for 2 weeks. You're thinking ahead, aren't you? Well, so we left the tarps off the roof and went to bed that night. And about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly heard a little rolling thunder. My eyes popped open. And I ran to the back door, I opened the back door, and sure enough, there was a thunderstorm heading this way. So I ran over to Wally's place, I banged on his door, and he didn't hear me. So I ran back to the house and thought, what am I going to do, what am I going to do? I've got to go up on the roof. So all I had on was my shorts and some running shoes, and I climbed up on the roof, and it started to rain. It so happened that we had been remodeling a little bit of the interior of our house, too, and we're in the middle of painting it. And I got to thinking, well, what if, this is going to be a thunderstorm. It's not safe up here. What if I got down there and it began to flow through, and the place where we actually didn't have a roof right now was right there over where Susan was asleep, my wife. I thought, what would happen if it started raining on my wife? And what would happen if I were on the roof during a thunderstorm? What should I do here? So I stayed on the roof. I got up there and I pulled that tarp over there and I dragged it over that roof as best I could, and I shimmied on back just as it started really coming down, and then the wind started whipping around and I hadn't had a chance to tack that tarp down. So it began to fly up and everything. So I was able to shimmy to the other side and tack it down, shimmy back to the other side, but I didn't have any more nails with me. And I couldn't get down off the roof. So I just shrunk down there into the valley of that roof and hung on to the top there and let it rain on me, and I held the tarp down with my body all during that summer thunderstorm. And I started thinking, well, I need to pray a little bit. So I started saying, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, until I got to the part of the valley of the shadow of death. I didn't feel any better. So I said a prayer of my own word. I said, dear God, if you happen to hit me by lightning, just give me enough that will juice up my sex life. It lasted about 20 minutes. I was drenched, but it finally stopped. And I lay there and I thought, I just saved my life. I climbed up off the roof. I went on inside, squeaking every step of the way into the bedroom. And when I got into the bedroom, my wife, Susan, looked at me, plastered all, I had hair in those days, all my hair was plastered down like a wet cat. And she says, Ronald, have you been up on the roof? Now, when my wife calls me Ronald, it means one of two things. Either I'm in really serious trouble or something good's about to happen. So I was hoping there. I said, well, yeah, I had to stay on the roof because we had to put the tarp up. I had to hold the tarp down. She said, oh, I was so worried about you. I was so scared something was wrong. And I knew, oh, something good can happen here. So I jumped right in bed with her. So reason number 3. I'm going to tell you another story before we get up there, though, actually. I heard a story at the National Storytelling Festival by a man named Kevin Kling. He's a rapid-fire storyteller, and it fit with my own sense of how much I was changing from the orthodox Christian beliefs to the ability to be somewhat amused by it. One time, one of the stories that Kevin tells, and I'll tell it kind of the way he tells it too, he said, when I was a little kid, I used to really like to listen to preachers in the Baptist church that we were in. They were pretty good too. They told stories that were quite interesting, and I was really interested in it all. But when I got to be a teenager, man, did they get boring. They couldn't tell anything that was worth listening to anymore. And I would start praying and I'd say, dear God, please save me from this preacher. Especially when they were talking about saving. That's when I wanted to be saved from them. And one day I was praying that prayer as it was a really boring sermon. And please, God, save me from his preaching. And all of a sudden I remembered my friend and his cats. You see, my friend was asked to take care of my neighbor's cats at one time, and he came over to my house and we were playing around, and he suddenly said, oh my goodness, I forgot all about my neighbor's cats. I said, oh, let's go over there and feed them. He said, I haven't fed them in about 4 or 5 days. Man, they're going to kill me. I don't know what I'm going to do. I said, when I get, oh, will you go over there with me? He said. I said, yeah, I'll go. So we went over there a little bit worried those cats were going to attack us, but we were surprised. When we got over there, those cats, they didn't know we were supposed to be feeding them. They thought we were their savior. They treated us like a savior. Well, that made me think, oh, maybe that happened to God. Maybe God one day had been, was up there and said, oh my goodness, I forgot all about the people on earth. I forgot about earth. Oh, no telling what they're going to do when I get back down there. They're going to kill me. And we did. I think I'll send Junior. That's a different twist on the story. How can we be peaceful when there are so many good reasons to fight? The third reason I'd say, there's so much to laugh at, including ourselves. There's so much to laugh at. But the hardest question about the good things to fight, or it's about suffering and death. There was a photojournalist, as often photojournalists have to go into places and take pictures of things, and keep their distance from it, because if they get involved in it, they won't get the pictures as it's authentically happening. So there was one photojournalist for either Look or Life magazine a number of years ago that went down into, I think it was Nicaragua or Honduras, and there was a great famine going on, and the UN had flown down there and was distributing food, and he saw these three children in a line of people waiting to get some food, and they were towards the back of the line, and he began to focus on these three little, there was an older little girl and two little children. The older girl was probably 10, and they were waiting in the line there, waiting in the line, and when they got to the front of the line, they had just run out of food. And but they looked so hungry, and they were so disappointed that the one worker there gave the children a banana. And they walked off together, slumped down with this one banana, and then they all three knelt down and said a little prayer around the banana. And he watched helplessly from his position as a photojournalist. He watched the older girl unpeel that banana and divide it in half and give one half to her brother and one half to her sister, and then she began to eat the peel. He was so touched by it that he began to cry, and he decided at that moment that he had to leave photojournalism and become a priest, which he did, and then he went to foreign countries to help out in those kinds of things. Another story about suffering and death. There was a couple that gave birth to, they were hoping to give birth to a child. They were being ministered to by a chaplain in a little hospital, and when the baby was born, the baby immediately died. And they were heart-stricken. And they had connected so well with this chaplain that they asked the chaplain, would you do a little memorial service in the chapel downstairs and meet us there at such and such a time and share some words for us? And of course the chaplain said yes, but this was a student chaplain. She immediately went upstairs to where her supervisor was and said, this is out of my league. Nothing like this has ever happened here at the hospital for me, and I wouldn't know what to say. Besides that, I have a young child. I couldn't say anything. I'd start crying. And the supervisor said, no, you'll find a way to minister to this family. No, I can't do it. Please, they need a senior chaplain to help them with this. Will you do it? No, this is something that you have to do. Go to your desk, write out what you need to, and go down there at the appointed time. And so that's just what she did. And when she got down there, she was the first one there. And then some of the family began to come in, and then the couple came in. And then the nurse came in holding the stillborn child and walked in, and when she walked into that room, everybody in the room began to cry, and they all were weeping. When they turned, then they turned to the chaplain to see what she would have to say and how she might be able to help them with words of prayer. But she had something stuck in her throat so big that she could not say a thing. And horrified, she looked out at him, and she was crying too. She couldn't speak, but she saw across the room some Kleenex. And she went over and she took some Kleenex, and she went and she began to dry the tears from everyone's cheek all around the room. And then she took that stillborn baby and she baptized that baby with the tears from the people. And then it was over. And she went upstairs, and her supervisor asked, what did you do? And she told him. He, like us, was stunned. And he said, how did you know to do that? I don't know, she said. I just don't know. Reason number 4. Death offers us, and suffering offers us, profound blessings. As sad as that story is, don't you feel uplifted? Isn't there something about it that makes you feel like life is worth living? My father died last September. Before he died, he started telling us that he was going to be on the admissions committee into heaven. And he said they're going to call it the Peter, Paul, and Charlie Committee. He told us that over and over again until we got really tired of it. All of us were trying, me and my brothers were trying to figure out something we could say back to him. One day it dawned on me what I could say. So he starts telling me one day about how you better not laugh at me, because I'm going to be on the admissions committee into heaven, and it's going to be the Peter, Paul, and Charlie Committee. I said, well, Dad, if you're going to be on a committee for all of eternity, it'll definitely be hell. He laughed and said, well, I don't believe in hell. I said, I'm not sure I believe in hell either, but I sure don't believe in committees. And I definitely prefer Peter, Paul, and Mary to Peter, Paul, and Charlie. We laughed about it, and the laugh came from so deep down inside that we knew that that was part of our way of understanding that his pending death was going to be okay. The last visit I had with my dad, I spent a day and a night with him, and the afternoon before I slept there that night, late in the afternoon, we got a call from the front desk upstairs saying there's a man who wants to visit with y'all. We can't figure out what he's saying, and we don't know who he is, but we'd like to escort him down there if it's okay with you and let you meet him. And if you don't know him, we'll just escort him right back out. So 3 people from the front desk came to escort this man downstairs, and we were a little nervous about it. I wondered who this is, and the door opens and a man walks in, and it was very clear to us quickly that he was deaf. My older brother works with the deaf. And so my mother looked up at this man and said, are you a friend of David's? And he could read her lips. And he said, yes, yes. And so he came in, and by reading lips, by writing notes, by a little bit of sign language that we could figure out, we began to make these connections about how he was married to someone I went to high school with, and so forth and so on. Everything we learned about each other in these connections was just delightful. It was a wonderful visit. And then it was time for him to go, and he turned to my dad, and he held up the I love you sign in death. And my dad, whose right hand didn't work very well anymore, held it up, and he couldn't move his hand into position to say I love you. And so this man, whose name was Jim Quinn, came over and began to put my dad's hand into an I love you shape. But by that time, my dad had already thought, I could do it with my left hand, and had done it with his left hand. And when Jim saw that, he laughed in glee and reached over and placed his hand in I love you, entwined with my dad's. It was a beautiful little thing. And then I escorted him back up to the front desk to let him out the door. And as I was walking back, I thought, I've met that man before. That was Wally. And I went back to went back into the room, and I said, I've met him before, I think. Well, not literally, but do you remember the story about Wally coming and saving me on the roof? And my dad said, yes, I do. And how I thought, as dumb as I am, even I know that's Jesus. My dad said, yes. My mother said, yes. And I said, well, that was Jesus. A strange man. You don't know who it is. It's got you a little nervous. And he comes in, and you begin to have this delightful, wonderful revelations and things that come to you about who this person is. And then as he leaves, this God-man, this something that represents, he's surrounded by the Shekinah, does this blessing for us that says, I love you and it will be all right. And we thought about that all night long, all 3 of us did. Next morning we knew that we thought about it because we talked about how we'd waken up in the middle of the night thinking about Jim Quinn. And my dad kept saying, did you see what he did to my hand? And then it was time for me to leave. And I thought it would be the last time I would ever see him. And I walked out the door. And as I went up to him first, of course I hugged him. He couldn't really even move in the chair. He was so feeble by now. I walked out the door, and then I turned back to look at him one last time, and there was my dad in that chair, holding his hand up in an I love you sign. Suffering and death offers us profound, profound blessings. It's another reason why we can be peaceful when there are so many good reasons to fight. And one last answer to it, I'm going to play on my dulcimer. The fifth reason I think of, and you can keep adding to this list in your own way, there's music, there's dance, and there's art. So I want to play you what is very much now a traditional Quaker tune.
questions of Dr. Ronald McDonald, this would be a good time for it. This is a time set aside for questions and answers.
I don't have answers, though. Responses, maybe.
Well, it was a very clear explanation of what Quakers believe.
But this Quaker believes.
Yeah.
There's a few Quakers in here. They can decide for themselves whether or not they believe the same thing as me. But thank you.
Do we not have some questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little more about the Quaker faith, or how it got started, and how it has possibly evolved over the years?
In the 1500s, shortly after the Reformation began, all over Europe there was a lot of questioning. It was like the Arab Spring that we're seeing. There's questioning was coming up. These claims that there's a different way to think about our spiritual lives, and Quakers were born during that period of time, where a young man named George Fox was disturbed by the Church of England. He felt like it was didn't have good answers to things, and it bothered him so much that he kept going around asking advice from lots of priests. Some who told him to drink more, some who told him to smoke tobacco, some told him to have a little more sex. Maybe might have been the only sex he would have had at that point in his life. And but it really bothered him that the answers weren't even good answers until one day he had a revelation that the answer could come not from outside of him but inside of him, which is what my whole talk has been about. That the answer to that question is an internal answer, not an external answer. And that answer, he thought, was the Christ within. And he thought the only way I can find out what the answers are to the questions of how to live my life is to sit down quietly and not listen to anybody but my own heart. And so he sat down and quiet, and he found, to his surprise, he wanted other people surrounding him in silence. But the other people would also feel inspired once in a while to say, I just had a revelation. I have an inspiration to say something. They called it ministering to each other. And so they began to realize that if they sat quietly without any expectation that anything happened except that God might speak to us, and then if God speaks to us and asks us also to speak to others, then we can share who we are and what we think are the answers and the responses to what life's problems bring us. And so it developed into what's called now an unprogrammed meeting for worship. So at 11 o'clock every Sunday morning, just down the street from here, the Memphis Friends meeting of Quakers walks into the room with there's two rituals. The first one, we walk into the room and shut up. We sit quietly and we wait for the way to open, for somebody to feel moved to speak. This morning I think there were like 6 messages. Sometimes there are no messages, but there were quite a number this morning in the meeting for worship. And then the second one is that at the end of an hour, the clerk will shake hands with the people next to him or her, and we'll all begin to stir a bit, and we'll have announcements and move on, and that will be the close of meeting for worship. And that's the way it's been traditionally for a long, long time. I think that everything about Quakers comes right out of that unprogrammed meeting for worship. For one thing, there's an equality testimony that men, women, black, white, no matter who it is equal and has the opportunity to preach to the meeting. Because if we sit in a circle and you don't know who God will choose, if you claim you know who God will choose, you probably should go to a church that claims it with you. Ours doesn't claim that. So equality became a testimony that we had, that all people are equal. It's one of the reasons why Quakers finally took a stand against slavery in America. Simplicity is another one of our testimonies, because it's such a simple worship service. Peace is one of them, because frankly it's really hard to be peaceful sitting next to somebody whose stomach is growling. There's no such thing as silence. We talk about silent worship, but it's not. It's actually, it means that you're going to hear things that you wouldn't normally hear, and some of them are embarrassing things to hear. People go to sleep in meeting once in a while and start snoring, which is usually kind of funny. But it can disturb the meditation, and so trying to find peace and quiet in the relation to other people, it's a hard thing to do. Integrity is another testimony, because it's about speaking from your heart.
Could you give viewers a reference as to where they could go to read, on the internet, and how to contact you?
I don't know if there's a address named Quaker.org. I know you can go to the friendsjournal.org, and that will take you to an awful lot of stuff. The Friends Journal is the magazine for unprogrammed Quakers more than anything else, and that's a good magazine to read. Anyone can come to our meeting at any time and have an experience there, and there's lots of literature that we have that we would give to a person.
If they're not in Memphis, they could go to friendsjournal.org and find
friendsjournal.org.
Friends somewhere in the world.
Generally, if you just Google Quakers, you'll probably get Friends Journal, and you'll probably get the Friends General Conference, and either of those are very good resources for learning more about Quakers.
Now, is there a structured organization for the church as well?
Yes. You may know that one of the types of organizing principles that churches use is called the congregational system, where the congregation votes on things. Well, we're a congregational system, except we don't vote. We wait until there's unity among us. We seek consensus, and so that our business meeting, which we have once a month, so it's called a monthly business meeting, it's just a monthly meeting. Our business meeting is going through the normal business that any organization runs through, but if we come into a controversial subject, we wait until we find 100% unity on it. And if one person says, I don't feel comfortable with that, we will labor with that person until either that person changes our mind or we change that person's mind. Or a third alternative is sometimes the person will say, I don't agree with this, but not so strongly that I want to stand in the way of the meeting. So I'll step aside and let the meeting make a decision. And actually, almost all congregations or organizations work on consensus, except for that very rare occasion where you have a vote. One of the reasons why Quakers have been very influential in America, and things like you don't have to swear on a Bible in court, because Quakers were being thrown in jail so much because they wouldn't do that. And you can say, I will affirm that I'll tell the truth, but I won't swear on the Bible, and courts won't object to that anymore. One of the reasons why Quakers have been so effective in having, taking stands against slavery and all, is because you can't walk into after the Quakers have made a decision, you can't find a dissenting voice. You ever heard a decision made by the Memphis School Board where they were almost unanimous, but the news media goes for the one or two people who are really mad about it, and so it sounds like it wasn't even close to unanimous because they got loud voices. That won't happen in a Quaker meeting. If it does, the meeting has made a mistake, and we'll generally call the meeting back together and say, we do have some dissent, let's listen some more.
Okay, so be sure to tell them again, friends.org, or just go in and
friendsjournal.org.
Or just go Google Quaker.
Or Google Quaker.
Okay. And are there other places besides the Friends meeting on Highland there? Or?
In Memphis, there's only one Quaker meeting. It's just
and that's located where?
Walnut Grove and Prescott.
Walnut Grove and Prescott.
It's on the very corner.
Yeah, right on the corner there.
Are there other questions?
I'm just curious, how did you go from being, the son of a Methodist minister to changing over and becoming a Quaker?
Well, Union Seminary, when I was there in 1968, I was there I started in 1974. In 1968, Union, as part of the rebellions that were going on with the Students for Democratic Society at Columbia University, took it seriously and said, we need to admit that we are part of the system that keeps women and blacks out of our system. And so they decided that in 5 years they would make the seminary 30% black and 50% women. And along the lines of what the nation was at the time. And they put their money where their mouth was, and when 1974 I started seminary there, they had just accomplished that goal. So it was part of my reason for being attracted to Union, but we did not know how to act. This was the first congregation or congregating of people of that much diversity, one of the first times in American history. And we were all confused as could be. Many of us sought personal therapy to figure out how to, including me. And I ended up studying black church history more than white church history. I ended up studying under James Cone, black liberation theology, and there was just so much. And it was the liberation theology center of the world at Union. So when I walked out of there, my thinking didn't fit with the Methodist Church anymore. There were liberation theology thinkers in the Methodist Church, but it was hard to find them. And so I felt all confused, and that was where I had all that noise inside. I mean, I started going from church to church to try to find some church that would not tick me off when I was listening to the preaching. They all did. It just ticked me off. So I finally said one day, well, I'm going to go to a Quaker meeting where they don't say anything, and maybe I won't get ticked off. So that was my pious reason for going to the Quaker meeting, and to my surprise, the silence was, or supposed silence, was luxurious for me. It allowed me to find some peace in the midst of all the fighting that I wanted to do. And that's how it began. I knew very quickly that Quaker meeting was a good place for me to be, and that I could root myself there, and I have since.
Any other questions? I want to thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. McDonald, for being here, and for the music as well. It was very good. Thank you for your explanations on Quakers and what they believe and why they believe it and what they're doing about it. Thank you very much. Next week we have Father David Knight. He's a very unusual priest. He may not like it, but I'll tell you, he's over 80. He looks like he's about 60, and he's a very dynamic fellow. So he'll be here. He lives at the convent in Fraser, where the nuns are cloistered. The following week, it'll be Reverend Robert J.B. McMillan, who is a independent New Thought minister from Little Rock, Arkansas. And then after that, Bernard Dozier, who is a longtime Unity minister and was the one who was responsible for the building of the church on Walnut Grove Road. And then on the last Sunday in February, we have our own Eddie Middleton, and he's a college level teacher, instructor on philosophy and ethics, but he's teaching a class right now on medieval Christianity, and so we've asked him to come and talk to us about that class, so we look forward to that too, Eddie. Thank you very much for being with us, everyone, on the Core Concepts lectures, and come back and see us next week. Thank you, Dad.